Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture number 7 in the history series on the subject, when did art begin? I'm going to consider 5 different theories about when art began. The first one, the first found object, and I'll explain when I get to it, is a theory that art began 3 million BCE, which means before the Common Era, BCE. Then there's a range of other possibilities, and the last one is the most recent, that art began in the Italian Renaissance. So this question about when art began is actually also the question of when art history should be thought of as beginning. When should you begin an art history textbook or an art history class? And that has changed over the centuries as well. So in books of art history written in Europe in the Renaissance, like Vasari's, art began in ancient Greece. There wasn't much awareness or interest in anything before that or outside it. By the 18th century in Europe, people were more aware of other cultures, and art was said to begin farther back in the ancient Middle East. Through the 18th and 19th century, there continued to be increasing awareness of other cultures in different parts of the world, and the origins of art kept getting pushed back. And in most contemporary textbooks, art is said to begin with Lascaux cave in France, or the so-called Venus figurines like the Venus of Willendorf. There are a couple of art history textbooks in which art actually is said to begin billions of years ago with other life forms that are quote-unquote artistic. And we'll come to that briefly later on in these lectures, but it's not a serious candidate for the origin of art. So it matters where art history is said to begin, or where art begins, because the starting point sets the tone for the book, and it also tells you as a reader what the author considers to be art, and it suggests what kind of story the book is going to tell. It suggests what the subject matter of the entire book is. Sometimes this problem of where to begin is called the problem of figure 1. What, as an author or as a teacher, do you choose as your figure 1? Where do you start? So here's a timeline that I'm going to use, a list of periods actually, and mega periods, which I'm going to use a couple different times in this lecture. These are the 3 parts of the Paleolithic period, that is Stone Age. It's conventionally divided into these 3 periods. Lower Paleolithic is the oldest one that's on top here, and this listing uses an abbreviation. So up at the top there it says 2.6 MA means millions of years before the present. To 300,000 Ka means thousands of years before the present. So this starts 2.6 million years before the present. After the lower Paleolithic comes the middle, and then the upper Paleolithic, and this chart ends, the Paleolithic ended at about 8,000 years before the present. Most of the familiar ancient quote-unquote art, in quotation marks, because that's what's in question here, most of it's in the upper Paleolithic, including Lascaux cave and the Venus figurines. Note the beginning at the top, 3 million BCE, because we'll come back to it, and the ending, 8,000, the end of the Paleolithic. We'll come back to both of those. So the first of these 5 is actually not a theory, but it's implied in Gardner's Art Through the Ages, that art began with a found object, not a made object. So this is actually the world's most popular art history textbook. Have a special lecture on it in coming up later. And it starts, in its most recent edition, with the Makapansgat jasperite cobble. It's a pebble. It's about 2.5 inches big, found in a cave in South Africa, associated with Australopithecus, non-Homo sapiens primate. So sometime around 3 million BCE, one of these Australopithecines found this jasperite cobble when they were out and brought it back to this cave site where it was finally discovered. And it's known that it was brought back from a great distance because it's made of jasperite. This mineral is not found in that place. And it's assumed that it was brought back because it looks like a human face. These are not man-made markings, they're natural markings. So someone selected this object and brought it back. Therefore, it's a found object in the way that modern art talks about found objects. So it's presented as possibly the first artwork, but if that's the case, it's a really strange choice because I don't think there are any other found objects in Gardner's textbook until Duchamp's fountain, which is 3 million years later than this one. And there are also no other art objects in Gardner's textbook after the Makapansgat Kabul until the Venus figurines, which are 2,600,000 years later. So that's quite a big gap in the history of art. Anyway, that's just a implication of the text. It's not an actual claim that Gardner makes. It would be interesting if it had been claimed in the textbook, because it would mean that Duchamp and this Kabul bracket their bookend the entire history of art, beginning and ending it. And people have said that, of course, about Duchamp, that he ends art. Okay, the second of these theories is that art begins when language begins. So there's the same chronology, and the Makapansgat Kabul's up at the top there. It's actually a bit above what's shown there. It's 3 million BCE. The transition between the middle Paleolithic, which is in black there, and the upper Paleolithic, where the lower arrow points, that transition is associated with a couple different things. First of all, it is supposed that spoken language began somewhere around then. This now has nothing to do with writing, which we'll come to in a later theory. Writing would have been about 60,000 years later, so there's not even near the beginnings of writing. There was no hints of writing until 60,000 years after this. But it has been argued that language began then. And one of the reasons that people give is that at this time, there's evidence of new processes of making. So the flint arrowheads and other blades were made in different ways, showing what's thought of as a capacity for flexible thinking and invention. So different kinds of arrowheads. And the idea is more or less that manual flexibility goes with visual flexibility, and possibly they go with language. Either language came first and gave people the ability, the capacity to think flexibly, or it was the other way around, and the making of objects and the seeing of objects was one of the things that elicited language. That would be a really interesting possibility for those of us interested in visual art, that art actually provoked language, as it were, instead of the other way around. There have been a couple of exhibitions and at least one book in 2011 that have proposed that some of these different blades, made by Neanderthals, by the way, another non-Homo sapiens primate ancestor, that they can be thought of as art because they go beyond functional requirements. They do more than people needed just to make their blades. This is a review of one of those exhibitions. This review actually written by Anne Wagner, who is a modernist art historian. Archaeology is not her field, but it shows the wide appeal of this possibility that at this point in prehistory, art could be said to have begun. So she says, as part of her review, quote, "The process discovers what's possible, as opposed to preordained." So in other words, as they were making these, they were attentive to the process, and they could alter it and change it, and that was what was really at stake, rather than just making another blade exactly like the previous blades. She says there's, quote, "a nuanced and exacting display of formal goals," meaning that they appreciated things like composition and so on, that both of these she thinks of as signs of art. This object's one of the most amazing ones in that particular show, where it's a blade, a flint blade, that was carved in such a way that a fossil shell was kept right at its center. So one counter-argument against the idea that this is the beginning of art would be a kind of simple one. That is, you could just say you don't need the word art here. You could just say these blades are designed objects, or you could call them ornaments. I think every time someone assigns the category art to something, as in these exhibitions, in that book, in this review, I think it's helpful to ask why they want these objects to be art, and what counts in these cases as art. In this case, I think for Anne Wagner, it's partly the idea that the people who made these were discovering form through their process, showing flexibility of thinking, and as some archaeologists would say, also showing the presence of language as opposed to just formulas. The third of the theories of the origins of of art is that it started with European cave paintings. I'll go back to the chronology one more time. This is the most widely held of these 5 theories that I'm going to be reviewing. At most textbooks of world art and art appreciation, art history, start out with cave painting. So some European cave paintings are in the period called Magdalenian. You can see the 3 red arrows point to these 3 periods I'm going to be mentioning. So Lascaux Cave, the most famous one, is Magdalenian, 17,000 to 12,000 years before the present, more or less. Others are Aurignacian. There's a fabulous film by Werner Herzog in which you can see him go into Chauvet Cave, which is another one of these that has paintings inside it. That's Aurignacian. It's substantially earlier than Lascaux Cave. And some of these objects that are nominated as the first art objects are Gravettian. The Gravettian period also includes the quote-unquote Venus figurines. So we're here about 20 to 30,000 years after the flint blades that we were just looking at. And also all of these sites were inhabited by Homo sapiens. So if biology and genetics makes a difference to the origin of art, or if you'd like to keep art a human thing, then you could also say this is a species difference. But at any rate, it's a time difference. So there are a number of reasons that people have taken caves like Lascaux to be the opening for the history of art. For example, the work looks naturalistic, so it seems to be connected to European art in particular, from the Greeks onward in particular, fits the narrative. Also, the examples are all in France or Spain, so they keep the familiar Eurocentric kind of narrative. This is not the kind of deliberate exclusionary Eurocentrism that I'll be talking about in later lectures. This is more a matter of the fact that when these caves were first discovered, mostly in the early 20th century, and first found their way into classrooms and into books of art history, that the only examples that were known of Upper Paleolithic painting of art were European. So that it helped the narrative, though, that you could stay within Europe. So there are reasons to reject this or to doubt it. Against it, it's been argued. For example, these are not actually naturalistic images in the senses that we use that term in other periods. Most of these walls with multiple figures, multiple animal figures, they overlap in such a way that it's pretty clear that the people who drew the one were not caring about the fact that another one was already on the wall. They weren't building a scene. They weren't making a picture. In this particular photo that I have here, there are a couple of large animals that seem to be in the back, which is a little strange from a perspectival kind of point of view. But in many of these, the cave surface is just absolutely covered with animals in all different orientations at all different scales. And the usual practice was apparently not to imagine that you were making any kind of a scene or a picture, that you were contributing to a landscape. The very idea of landscape actually only started in Europe in the 15th century. So they're not naturalistic in the senses of that word that we've become accustomed to. They're naturalistic in the sense that they're attentive to anatomy and sometimes attentive to gait of the animals, things like that, but not in the sense that they're building a picture with fictive space, with borders, with a frame, and so on. Also, they presumably had ritual uses, and this expression, ritual uses, basically, when an archaeologist says that, means that they have no idea what they were used for, but they couldn't have been just for pleasure or decoration. One of the reasons that's often given for that is that in a number of these caves, they're in really inaccessible places, that they could have been painted much more out in the open, closer to the cave entrance, but they were put in places that are very hard to get to. So the assumption is that the reason people went there was to perform some ritual. That's a good word to be skeptical of, ritual, whenever you see that having to do with prehistoric practices. It's just a placeholder. It doesn't really mean, anything in particular, but it does seem clear that they were doing something while they were in these spaces with these pictures that they made, that they weren't just decorations like you would put in a more obvious, accessible place. That does also happen in rock art. So they're not really similar to classical and later European art, and we basically spend most of our time looking at these, projecting our own images onto them and sort of hoping that we're right. Okay, the fourth theory is that art began in the ancient Middle East. So here's the that list for the last time, that timeline of the Paleolithic. So the Heilbronn timeline that's on the site maintained by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City begins around 8000 BCE, right at the end of the Paleolithic, right at the bottom of this chart. This is conventionally one of the times when agriculture began, although that's a really tricky thing to decide because agriculture began at many different times and places, and it also began intermittently and was repeatedly rediscovered and reinstituted. But in general, and especially in Europe, that those few thousand of years in and around 8000 BCE also correspond with the rise of settlements, that is to say, the presence of agriculture that enables people to settle down, and also with stone structures, which in art history quickly become assimilated to architecture. So under this heading of architecture, in the period from 5000 BCE to 3000 BCE, there are a number of large stone structures throughout Europe that are made by very different cultures. This is a hypogeum, which means an underground carved-out chamber in Malta. So there is evidence of large-scale permanent construction, which can be taken in turn as evidence of agriculture. So hence the end of the Stone Age and also the beginning of other kinds of cultures. At the end of this period, so starting 8000 BCE, going up through the monumental stone structures toward 3000 BCE, right at the end, around 3000 BCE, there are also visual stories. This is the top of an object called the Warka vase, which is in Baghdad, and it tells some visual stories with the help of symbols, which you could see to the left behind the figure. They're naturalistic, but they also stand for things, sometimes like bushels of wheat and things like that. Right about at this time, this is when writing was starting to develop in Egypt, elsewhere in the Middle East. And within 1,000 years, by 2000 BCE, these kind of visual narratives are told with the accompaniment of actual script, actual writing, cuneiform and hieroglyphic script and so on. So if you like to think of art beginning in this time, then you have the interesting possibility that art began along with writing. Visual art and writing began together. Just as, if you like the previous theory, you could say that art began with speaking. Both of them are interesting possibilities, and in both cases, the art might have led. So in the case of the flint blades, it's possible that the flexibility of process that is visible in some of those Neanderthal blades might have helped language to develop and provoked it in some ways, catalyzed it. And in this case, it's possible that the desire to tell stories might have helped these symbols that you see here congeal, and ultimately might have helped along the development of writing. There's a lot to be said about this. It's a whole separate subject, but it is kind of intriguing that these two theories out of the five make art correspond with first speaking and then maybe writing. There are counter-arguments also to this. One of the problems with saying that art began in this period, 8000 to 3000 BCE, more or less, is that if you do that, you're starting with a number of cultures in ancient Middle East, usually Sumeria, after it Assyria, Egypt also, Greece, Rome, and so on. And they don't actually form a sequence because they're very different cultures. Their languages, in most cases, completely unrelated to each other. All of the gods, the myths, completely different. They're not really a sequence in the way that more recent cultures can be connected to each other. They're very much disconnected from each other. And this is true throughout world art. So just to give you a couple of other examples, the same problem happens if you want to say that Indian art begins with the prehistoric Indus Valley civilization. So that culture, also known as the Harappan culture, produced artifacts with an undeciphered script on them. So we're, again, possibly at the beginning or near the beginning of writing. But the claims that are still made that Indian art begins at the Indus Valley Civilization, these are claims, by the way, that are now associated with Hindu nationalism, that Indian art can trace its way back all the way to the Indus Valley Civilization. These claims run across the same problem as that sequence from Sumerian to Akkadian to Egyptian and so on, and that is that you have to pass through a sequence of completely disconnected cultures, disconnected linguistically, culturally, theologically, and in terms of their law and so on, in order to get to the present. So you're not really producing a continuous, like it's not a family tree. They're separate cultures. Same thing happens if you start your history of China with Longshan pottery, or the history of Japan with the Jomon culture, or in South America if you start with Valdivia, or in Saharan Africa, the Nubian culture, or in North America, in this photograph, you can say North American art started with mound builders. But then you run into that same kind of problem because, to take this example, these are the Cahokia mounds, which are in southern Illinois. They're called Cahokia because that's the Native American tribe that was and is associated with this area. But the Cahokia tribe has nothing in common with the now completely disappeared culture, now entirely nameless, that actually built these. Those things predated them by a number of centuries. So these choices of places to say that art began around 8,000 to 3,000 BC, they're all motivated by regional or national senses of history, and they all involve linking older cultures to newer ones, even though they may not have any connections. So these are not arguments that art didn't begin in these places. These are arguments that it doesn't make sense to say the history of art began in these places. You can still say this is how art began. So the last of these 5 theories about the origin of art is that it began in the Italian Renaissance. There are a number of reasons for saying this. For example, the Italian Renaissance is the first time in the West that objects were made for pleasure and not for religious use. That's a painting by Sofonisba Guisola, who's one of the women artists who was, quote-unquote, rediscovered by a wave of feminist art historians in the 20th century, had been relatively neglected before then, and we'll come to that in later lectures. So this is, she's representing herself as an artist, and this particular painting hopefully would sell, but at least it would increase her reputation. And that kind of painting, easel painting, that she's showing herself doing, it's a kind of a bridge, because the painting that she's making could presumably be a painting that could be sold and used in a church, in a home, in an altar, and so on. But the painting that you're looking at in which she paints it is something that wouldn't have been imaginable before the Renaissance. The painting that shows her self-portrait, would be made for other reasons that were not religious. That was something very new in the Renaissance. Also new in the Renaissance was the field of aesthetics, which gave the possibility of judging things, as I said in the very first lecture, calling them beautiful and deciding on their merits and comparing them and so on, began just shortly after the Renaissance, so it could be assimilated also to the Renaissance. And there's a number of other reasons which would come out in other lectures for saying that art began in the Renaissance. But the most fundamental one here is that before the Renaissance in the West, objects that you made, like the one that she's painting here in the painting, would have had religious uses. And the Renaissance was also the European origin of art criticism, art history, and art competitions, which is material that I cover in other lectures. So lots of different reasons for saying this. The problems with claiming that art began in the Renaissance are of a different kind than the problems that come from the other claims. Main problems are practical, because if you say that art began in the West in the Renaissance and elsewhere in other centuries, it would mean that you're saying that every other object in the entire art history survey should really be called an artifact or an object, or maybe it should just be named by its medium, painting, sculpture, etc. There are very few cultures and times in the history of art when objects, visual objects, became detached from ritual or religious usages. It happened in India and happened in China, and just a couple of centuries, relatively speaking, to the number of cultures and number of centuries total. So it would mean that art history would shrink to a very small proportion of what it's usually imagined to be. And that creates a strange problem for the art history textbook, because it means that your art history textbook is a kind of apples and oranges thing, which has a small narrative of art embedded in an ocean of practices, maybe even going back to 3 million BCE, which have absolutely nothing to do with art. So it becomes counterintuitive. Okay, so this is an open-ended question. I'm going to continue the same kind of question in the next lecture.